I'm Noah, 22, and everything changed when my stepfather declared adopted kids get nothing, right before learning about my $30 million inheritance from a biological father I never knew existed. What started as Edward Hargrove's final humiliation became the moment that revealed just how wrong he'd been about everything, including who deserved to be called family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how being treated like nothing led me to discover I was worth more than any of them ever imagined. Growing up in the Hargrove household meant learning early that love came with conditions, and those conditions never seemed to apply to me the same way they did to Jasper and Lila. Edward made sure I understood the distinction between his real children and his wife's baggage from her previous relationship. Every family dinner included subtle reminders that I was eating food he provided, sleeping under a roof he paid for, wearing clothes he bought. "Remember to thank Ned for dinner, Noah," my mother Camilla would say, her voice carrying that nervous edge it always had when she sensed tension building. She never asked Jasper or Lila to thank him. They belonged at that table in ways I apparently never would, no matter how many years passed or how hard I tried to earn my place. The financial control started small and grew more suffocating as I got older. While Jasper got a car for his 16th birthday, I was told that adopted kids needed to learn the value of hard work. When Lila wanted to join the expensive dance studio across town, Edward wrote the check without hesitation. When I asked about guitar lessons, he launched into a 20-minute lecture about appreciation and entitlement. "Blood makes family, Noah," he'd say during these conversations, usually while Camilla busied herself with dishes or laundry, anything to avoid having to defend her son. "Everything else is just legal paperwork." The message was clear. I was tolerated, not treasured, and any benefits I received were charity that could be withdrawn at his discretion. College became the battleground where Edward's true feelings about my place in the family crystallized into something cruel and deliberate. Jasper's college fund had been growing since birth, carefully invested and regularly discussed at family gatherings. Lila's education account was equally robust, with Edward often mentioning how proud he was to provide for his children's futures. My college fund, according to Edward, didn't exist because adopted kids need to prove they deserve investment. Instead, I was expected to work part-time at his insurance office, filing papers and answering phones for barely above minimum wage, while watching my step-siblings receive weekly allowances that exceeded my monthly earnings. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was working for money to pay for college while living in a house where my siblings' education was already guaranteed. The exclusion extended beyond money into the small, daily humiliations that Edward seemed to enjoy orchestrating. Family photos were carefully arranged with Jasper and Lila flanking their parents while I stood slightly apart, if I was included at all. Business partners and friends were introduced to my son Jasper and my daughter Lila, while I was simply Camilla's boy, or sometimes just Noah with no relationship defined. Holiday gifts followed a similar pattern. Jasper and Lila received expensive electronics, jewelry, or experiences, while I got practical items like socks or school supplies. "We believe in teaching different children different lessons," Edward would explain to relatives who occasionally questioned the obvious disparities, his smile never reaching his eyes when he looked at me. My mother's complicity in this treatment was perhaps more painful than Edward's open hostility. Camilla had married Edward when I was 8, desperate for stability after years of struggling as a single parent. She'd made it clear that our survival depended on keeping Edward happy, which meant accepting his rules about family hierarchy. "He's doing his best to accept you," she'd whisper during my teenage years when I'd try to talk to her about the unfairness. "We can't ask for more than that. We need this family, Noah. Try to understand." Her fear of losing the security Edward provided made her complicit in every slight, every exclusion, every reminder that I was the outsider they'd reluctantly accommodated. The final insult came during my senior year of high school, when Edward casually mentioned that there would be no family contribution to my college expenses. "Real children get family support," he said over dinner, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. "Everyone else figures it out on their own. It builds character." Jasper was heading to a private university in the fall, his tuition, room, board, and spending money all covered. Lila still had 2 years of high school left, but her college account was already funded beyond what most families could ever provide. I would be starting community college in the fall, working full-time to pay for classes I'd take at night, living at home under Edward's roof, and constant reminders of my lesser status. That Tuesday morning in March, everything began to change with a phone call that Edward answered with his usual authoritative tone. "Hargrove residence," he said, expecting the call to be for him as most important calls were. The voice on the other end asked specifically for Noah Sinclair Lewis. using both my birth name and the hyphenated version I'd never heard spoken aloud in our house. Edward's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion as he handed me the phone with obvious reluctance. "Someone wants to talk to you," he said, his tone suggesting that people wanting to talk specifically to me was both unusual and potentially problematic. The caller identified himself as Calder Vance, an estate executor who needed to meet with me regarding a matter of inheritance. As I hung up the phone, Edward's questions came rapid fire, demanding to know who that was and what they wanted. For the first time in my life, I had information that Edward didn't control, and the shift in power dynamics was so subtle, yet so significant, that even Camilla looked up from her morning routine to watch our exchange with nervous anticipation. The years leading up to that phone call had been a masterclass in systematic degradation, with Edward perfecting the art of making me feel grateful for scraps, while my step-siblings feasted on abundance. What I thought was normal family dynamics was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign to keep me dependent, desperate, and constantly aware of my precarious position in the only family I'd ever known. The phone call from Calder Vance represented the first crack in Edward's absolute control. But the foundation of that control had been built over 14 years of deliberate conditioning. The college fund incident had been the most devastating blow, though it took me years to understand the full scope of Edward's manipulation. When I was 12, I'd overheard him telling Camilla about setting aside money for my education, the same way he did for Jasper and Lila. I'd felt such relief knowing that my future was secure, that despite all the daily reminders of my outsider status, Edward was still planning to invest in my success. For 3 years, I believed that money was growing in an account somewhere, earning interest and building toward my dreams of studying engineering at a real university. The truth came out during my sophomore year of high school, when I casually mentioned my college fund during a conversation with Jasper about his university plans. "What college fund?" Edward had asked, his tone genuinely confused. "Noah doesn't have a college fund. We discussed this years ago, Camilla. Remember? We decided that adopted children need to learn self-reliance." The look on my mother's face told me everything I needed to know about whether this conversation had actually happened, or whether Edward was rewriting history to suit his current narrative. The money that should have been mine had been redirected into what Edward called family investments, which primarily meant Jasper's car, Lila's dance lessons, family vacations where I stayed home to watch the house, and eventually Jasper's private school tuition when he decided the public school wasn't challenging enough. "Every dollar we invest in our real children benefits the whole family," Edward explained when I finally worked up the courage to ask directly about the missing college fund. "Jasper's success reflects well on all of us. Lila's achievements make us proud. Your job is to support their success and learn from their example." The casual way he delivered this explanation, as if it were perfectly reasonable to steal one child's future to enhance another's opportunities, was almost more devastating than the theft itself. My work schedule became another tool of control, designed to keep me too exhausted to question the family dynamics or develop relationships outside Edward's influence. Starting at 15, I worked 20 hours a week at his insurance office, supposedly learning valuable business skills, but actually performing mind-numbing data entry and filing that could have been done by anyone. "This is character building," Edward would say when I complained about missing school events or social activities because of work obligations. "Jasper and Lila don't need to work because they have other ways to develop character. You need to learn the value of hard work because that's the path available to you." The irony that my character building was subsidizing their leisure activities was never acknowledged, though the message was clear enough. While I worked evenings and weekends for $7 an hour, Jasper received a monthly allowance of $300 just for existing as Edward's biological son. Lila got $200 a month plus unlimited spending on clothes, makeup, and social activities. When I asked about getting an allowance instead of working so many hours, Edward's response was swift and decisive. "Allowances are for children who don't need to prove their worth," he said. "You work for your money because you need to understand that nothing in life is free, especially for people in your situation." The phrase "people in your situation" became his favorite way of referring to my adopted status, as if being unwanted by my biological father was a character flaw that required constant correction and improvement. The social isolation was perhaps the most insidious form of control, because it seemed to happen naturally, rather than through Edward's direct intervention. When friends called the house, Edward would answer with barely concealed irritation, making it clear that social calls were an inconvenience he tolerated rather than welcomed. "Noah's busy with work responsibilities" became his standard response, regardless of whether I was actually working or just sitting at home doing homework. Over time, friends stopped calling, and I stopped making plans that required coordination through the family phone line. "It's better this way," Camilla would say when I complained about my shrinking social circle. "Edward thinks you're too easily influenced by other kids. This way you can focus on school and work without distractions." The family introductions became more pointed as I got older, and Edward's friends began asking questions about the obvious disparities in how his children were treated. "This is my son Jasper, who's going to take over the business someday," he'd say with obvious pride. "And my daughter Lila, who's going to be a professional dancer." Then, almost as an afterthought, "And Noah, who we're helping to become self-sufficient." The phrase, "helping to become self-sufficient," was Edward's way of explaining why I looked older than my age, why I worked while his children didn't, why I wore the same clothes while they got new wardrobes each season. It sounded generous and supportive to outsiders while actually describing a systematic campaign to ensure I never felt entitled to the same treatment as his biological children. The breaking point should have come during my senior year, when Edward announced that my 18th birthday would mark the beginning of my transition to complete independence. "Real adults pay rent," he declared over dinner one night, cutting his steak with the same methodical precision he brought to dismantling my sense of security. "Starting next month, Noah will be contributing $300 monthly for room and board. It's time he learned what the real world costs." $300 was exactly what Jasper received as his monthly allowance, money he spent on video games and dates, while I would be paying it back to Edward just for the privilege of sleeping in the same house where I'd lived for 10 years. Camilla's weak protest that I was still in high school was dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Plenty of high school students work full-time and pay their own way. Noah's been coddled long enough." The morning Calder Vance called, asking for Noah Sinclair Lewis, Edward's immediate suspicion revealed just how completely he'd controlled information about my past. "Who even knows you by that name?" he demanded after I hung up, his tone suggesting that maintaining any connection to my identity before he became my stepfather was somehow suspicious or inappropriate. The truth was that I barely remembered using that name myself, having been Noah Hargrove for so long that my original identity felt like someone else's life. But something about hearing it spoken aloud by a stranger activated a curiosity I'd learned to suppress, a wondering about the parts of my story that had been edited out of the official family narrative. That afternoon, I found myself staring at the business card Calder Vance had told me he would send by overnight delivery, wondering what could possibly connect me to someone who dealt with estates and inheritances. Edward had made it clear throughout my childhood that my biological father was a deadbeat who'd abandoned my mother and wanted nothing to do with his responsibilities. "Some men aren't meant to be fathers," he'd say whenever the subject came up, which was rarely and always in the context of his own superiority. Lucky for you, I stepped up where he failed. The idea that this man might have left me anything seemed impossible. But for the first time in years, I found myself wondering if there were parts of my story that Edward might not know or might have chosen not to share. The business card that arrived the next morning felt like holding evidence of a parallel universe where my name meant something to someone who wasn't obligated to tolerate me. Calder Vance, estate executor. It read in simple black lettering, with a phone number and an address in downtown that suggested legitimate business rather than some elaborate prank. Edward examined the card with the suspicious intensity he usually reserved for bills that arrived higher than expected, turning it over as if searching for hidden meaning or some indication that this was connected to a mistake he could easily correct. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Deadbeats don't leave estates. Someone's got the wrong Noah Lewis." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, which meant missing my shift at Edward's office and enduring his pointed remarks about responsibility and commitment. "Real employees don't just skip work for mysterious appointments," he said over breakfast, his tone suggesting that whatever this meeting was about, it was an inconvenience that reflected poorly on my judgment. "If this turns out to be some kind of scam or sales pitch, you'll be working Saturday to make up the lost time." Camilla ate her cereal in silence, occasionally glancing between Edward and me with the nervous expression she wore whenever family dynamics shifted in ways she couldn't predict or control. The tension in the kitchen felt familiar yet different, charged with an uncertainty that Edward clearly didn't like but couldn't immediately eliminate. Calder Vance's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building where the elevator buttons required a key card, and the lobby displayed the kind of understated wealth that suggested serious business conducted by serious people. Walking into that environment felt like entering a world where people like me didn't belong, where my discount store clothes and nervous energy marked me as clearly out of place. The receptionist asked for Noah Sinclair Lewis specifically, using the full name with a professionalism that made it sound official and important rather than like a mistake that needed correction. When Calder emerged from his office to greet me, He was exactly what I'd expected from his voice. 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of authoritative presence that reminded me of Edward but without the underlying cruelty. "Thank you for coming, Noah," he said, gesturing toward his office with a warmth that felt genuine. "I know this must be confusing. Please have a seat and I'll explain everything." His office overlooked the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furnishings that spoke of success and permanence. 2 thick manila folders sat on his desk, labeled with names I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. "First, I need to confirm some basic information. Your full birth name is Noah Sinclair Lewis, born September 15th, and your biological father was Dr. Elias Ward." The name hit me like a physical blow, not because I recognized it, but because hearing it spoken aloud gave substance to a person who had existed only as an absence in my life. The story Calder told over the next hour systematically dismantled everything I thought I knew about my origins and my worth. Dr. Elias Ward hadn't been a deadbeat who abandoned his responsibilities. He'd been a software engineer who'd built a tech company from nothing and sold it 3 months ago for $37 million. More importantly, he'd been searching for me for the past 18 years, ever since my mother disappeared with me during what he thought was a temporary separation. "Your father hired private investigators," Calder explained, opening one of the folders to reveal photographs, newspaper clippings, and documentation that painted a picture of a man who'd never stopped looking for his son. "He found your adoption record 6 months ago and was planning to contact you when he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He died 8 weeks ago." The legal documents spread across Calder's desk told a story that contradicted every assumption about my place in the world that Edward had carefully cultivated. Dr. Ward had never signed away his parental rights. Camilla had falsified his signature on the adoption papers, claiming he was dead when Edward wanted to formally adopt me. The private investigators' reports showed years of dead ends and false leads, including multiple attempts to contact Camilla that she'd apparently ignored or hidden. "Your father left very specific instructions," Calder continued, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow felt I should. "He wanted you to understand that he never chose to leave you, and that everything he built was always meant to be yours." The video message was perhaps the most devastating part of the revelation, watching a stranger who shared my features tell me about a love I'd never known existed. Dr. Ward looked tired in the recording, his illness evident, but his voice strong as he explained how every success in his life had felt incomplete without being able to share it with his son. "I know you probably grew up thinking I didn't want you," he said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that were unmistakably like mine. "Nothing could be further from the truth. Every day for 18 years, I've wondered what you looked like, what you were interested in, whether you were happy. I hope whoever raised you gave you the love and support you deserved, and I hope you'll understand that I would have been there if I'd known where to find you." The inheritance details were staggering in their scope and specificity. $30 million, carefully invested and structured to provide maximum flexibility and protection. Dr. Ward had anticipated that my adoptive family might try to claim portions of the inheritance, so everything was locked in an irrevocable trust that only I could access once certain conditions were met. "He was very concerned about people who might try to take advantage of you," Calder explained, showing me the legal protections that had been built into every aspect of the estate. "He wanted to make sure this money would give you freedom, not make you a target." The trust included funds for education, housing, business investments, and what Dr. Ward had called life exploration, recognizing that someone who'd grown up without resources might need time to discover their own interests and goals. The drive home from Calder's office felt like traveling between 2 different realities, one where I was Noah Hargrove, the unwanted stepchild working to earn his place, and another where I was Noah Sinclair Lewis, heir to a fortune built by a father who'd never stopped loving me. The weight of the truth sat in my chest like something physical, making it hard to breathe normally as I tried to process the magnitude of the deception that had shaped my entire life. Camilla hadn't just hidden my father's attempts to contact us. She'd actively participated in making me believe I was unwanted while allowing Edward to treat me as less than his biological children. Every humiliation, every reminder of my outsider status, every moment I'd felt grateful for their reluctant acceptance had been built on lies. Walking into the Hargrove house that evening felt like infiltrating enemy territory, knowing what I now knew about how thoroughly I'd been manipulated and controlled. Edward looked up from his newspaper with the expectant expression of someone waiting for confirmation that the mysterious meeting had been resolved in his favor. "Well?" he asked, not bothering to hide his curiosity. "What was that about? Some kind of insurance thing?" The casual way he dismissed the possibility that anything important could happen to me without his knowledge or involvement suddenly seemed less irritating and more pathetic. For the first time in my life, I possessed information that Edward didn't control, knowledge that could change everything about the family dynamics he'd spent 14 years carefully constructing. "Just some paperwork about my biological father," I said, keeping my voice neutral while watching his reaction carefully. The slight stiffening of his posture, the way his eyes flicked toward Camilla, told me that this topic made him uncomfortable in ways I'd never noticed before. Apparently there were some loose ends that needed to be tied up. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the truth either, and for the first time since I'd lived in this house, I felt the power that came from knowing more than I was willing to share. The secret sat between us during dinner, invisible but present, while I wondered how long I could keep pretending that everything was the same when absolutely everything had changed. The second meeting with Calder Vance revealed the true scope of what my biological father had built, not just in terms of money, but in the careful planning he'd done to protect me from exactly the kind of people who had controlled my life for the past 14 years. The trust documents were inches thick, filled with provisions that Dr. Ward had crafted specifically to prevent manipulation, coercion, or theft by family members, who might see my inheritance as their opportunity rather than mine. As Calder walked me through each section, I began to understand that my father had anticipated Edward's behavior with startling accuracy, having dealt with enough controlling personalities in business to recognize the warning signs even from a distance. "Your father was very specific about this," Calder explained, pointing to a clause that made my stomach clench with recognition. "He was concerned that your adoptive family might try to pressure you into sharing or signing over portions of the inheritance. Everything is structured so that you maintain complete control, with protections against coercion, undue influence, or what he called emotional blackmail by people who claim to love you." The phrase hit too close to home, describing perfectly the dynamic I'd lived with for years, where every privilege came with strings attached, and every expression of family affection carried an implied debt that could be called in at Edward's discretion. "The video messages, Dr. Ward had left were more personal and devastating than anything Calder had prepared me for during our first meeting. There were dozens of them, recorded over the months between his diagnosis and death, each one addressing different aspects of what he imagined my life might have been like and what he hoped my future could become. "I keep wondering if you play guitar," he said in one recording, gesturing toward a vintage Fender hanging on the wall behind him. "I always wanted to learn but never made the time. There's money in the trust specifically for music lessons if that's something you're interested in, or art classes or travel or whatever brings you joy. I spent too many years focused only on building wealth and not enough time figuring out what made life worth living." The financial details were overwhelming in their complexity and generosity. Beyond the $30 million inheritance, Dr. Ward had structured ongoing income streams from patent licensing, stock dividends, and real estate investments that would provide substantial monthly income for the rest of my life. "He wanted to make sure you'd never have to work for someone who didn't value you," Calder explained, showing me projected income statements that exceeded what most people earned in a year. "Financial independence means real freedom to choose your path, whether that's more education, starting a business, or just taking time to figure out who you are when you're not worried about money." The most shocking revelation came when Calder showed me the private investigators' reports from the past 2 years, detailed surveillance and research that painted an uncomfortably accurate picture of my life in the Hargrove household. Dr. Ward had known about the disparate treatment, the financial control, Edward's habit of introducing me as Camilla's boy, rather than as his stepson. "Your father was very angry about what he observed," Calder said carefully. "He considered legal action to remove you from that environment, but his lawyers advised that as a terminally ill man with no previous relationship with you, he was unlikely to succeed in court. Instead, he focused on making sure you'd have resources to leave as soon as you became an adult." The protective measures Dr. Ward had built into the trust were specifically designed to counter tactics that Edward was already using against me. No family member could be added as a beneficiary or given access to trust funds without my explicit written consent, witnessed by independent legal counsel. Any attempt to pressure me into sharing the inheritance would trigger additional legal protections, including restraining orders and criminal charges for financial elder abuse if I were still considered a minor under their care. He studied cases of young people who inherited money and lost it to manipulative family members, Calder explained. "Every protection in this trust was designed to prevent that from happening to you." The business Dr. Ward had built and sold just months before his death had been a software company specializing in financial security systems, which explained his sophisticated understanding of how money could be stolen or misappropriated by people in positions of trust. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Edward made his living in insurance, supposedly protecting people from financial disasters, my biological father had spent his career actually protecting people from the kind of financial manipulation I'd been experiencing my entire life. The sale of his company had been timed specifically to maximize the inheritance he could leave me, with Dr. Ward working literally until weeks before his death to ensure every dollar possible would be available for my future. Reading through Dr. Ward's personal letters was like discovering an alternate version of my life where someone had been thinking about my welfare and happiness every single day. He'd written about wondering what subjects I liked in school, whether I was athletic, if I had friends, whether my adoptive family treated me well. "I hope you're loved," read one letter dated just months before his death. "I hope someone tells you every day that you're valuable and wanted and deserving of good things. I hope you never have to doubt your worth or beg for acceptance from people who should give it freely. If that's not the case, I hope this inheritance gives you the power to find people who will value you the way you deserve to be valued." The legal meeting also revealed the extent to which Camilla had actively hidden Dr. Ward's attempts to contact us over the years. The private investigator had documented 17 different attempts to reach her through mail, phone calls, and even hiring intermediaries to make contact. She'd moved us twice during my childhood, both times shortly after the investigator had tracked us to our current location. "Your mother was very careful to avoid contact," Calder said diplomatically. "The investigator believed she was deliberately hiding to prevent your father from finding you." The implications were staggering. Camilla hadn't just passively allowed Edward to treat me as less than his biological children. She'd actively worked to prevent my real father from offering me an alternative. When I left Calder's office that afternoon, I carried with me not just the knowledge of my inheritance, but a USB drive containing all of Dr. Ward's video messages, copies of every letter he'd written to me over the years, and documentation of every attempt he'd made to find me. The weight of evidence in my backpack felt like carrying proof of a love I'd never known existed, alongside evidence of a betrayal more profound than I'd ever imagined possible. For 18 years, I'd believed I was unwanted by my biological father, while working desperately to earn acceptance from Edward. The truth was exactly the opposite. My real father had moved heaven and earth to find me, while my stepfather had never seen me as anything more than an inconvenience to be managed. The drive home felt like traveling toward a confrontation I wasn't ready for but couldn't avoid much longer. Edward's questions about my mysterious meetings had become more pointed and demanding, his suspicion growing each time I returned with vague answers about paperwork and legal formalities. The trust documents hidden in my backpack contained enough explosive information to destroy every assumption that held our family together. But I wasn't sure I was ready for the fallout that truth would bring. Part of me wanted to savor this secret knowledge a little longer, to enjoy the feeling of knowing something Edward couldn't control or manipulate before everything changed forever. That evening at dinner, as Edward made his usual comments about responsibility and earning one's place in the family, I found myself watching him with new eyes. Every condescending lecture about my character defects, every reminder that I should be grateful for their reluctant acceptance, every comparison to Jasper and Lila's superior status suddenly seemed less threatening and more pathetic. He was lecturing someone who would soon have more money than he'd made in his entire career about the importance of appreciating what little he'd chosen to provide. The irony was so profound it was almost funny, though I knew the humor wouldn't last once the truth came out, and Edward realized just how completely the balance of power in our household was about to shift. The secret became harder to carry, as Edward's suspicions intensified into something approaching paranoia about my weekly meetings with Calder Vance. What had started as casual questions about my whereabouts evolved into detailed interrogations about who I was meeting, what we discussed, and why these appointments required such secrecy. "Normal legal matters don't take weeks to resolve," he said over breakfast one morning, his tone suggesting that my continued evasiveness was both suspicious and disrespectful. "If this is about your biological father's debts or legal problems, we need to know about it before it affects this family." The irony that he was worried about my father's financial situation affecting his household was almost too much to bear, knowing what I knew about the $30 million waiting in trust accounts. The pressure campaign Edward launched was methodical and familiar, using every tool of emotional manipulation he'd perfected over 14 years of keeping me dependent and compliant. Camilla was deployed as the concerned mother, expressing worry that I was being taken advantage of by lawyers who might be charging fees for services I didn't understand. "These legal people can be very expensive, Noah," she said during one of our increasingly frequent private conversations. "If there are costs involved, we should discuss them as a family." Edward has experience with legal matters that might be helpful. The suggestion that I should share confidential information about my inheritance with the man who'd systematically stolen my college fund and charged me rent for living in his house was so absurd, it took genuine effort to keep my expression neutral. Jasper and Lila were recruited into the campaign with their own versions of concern and curiosity that felt more aggressive with each passing day. "Dad thinks you're hiding something important," Jasper said one afternoon when he cornered me in the kitchen, his tone carrying the same authoritative entitlement that Edward used when demanding information. "If this affects the family, we have a right to know what's going on." Lila's approach was more manipulative, playing the worried sister who just wanted to help her brother navigate whatever legal complications he'd stumbled into. "You can trust us, Noah," she said with practiced sincerity. "We're family. Whatever this is about, we'll support you." The word family, from people who'd spent years making sure I understood I wasn't really part of theirs, would have been laughable if it weren't so transparently calculating. The financial pressure Edward applied was more subtle, but equally deliberate, designed to remind me of my dependence on his generosity while creating urgency around my need to resolve whatever legal situation was consuming my time. My rent was raised from $300 to $500 monthly, supposedly to reflect increased utility costs and property taxes that coincidentally came due right after my meetings with Calder became regular. "Adult children pay market rates," Edward explained when I questioned the increase. "Consider it motivation to settle whatever legal issues are keeping you from focusing on more important things, like your future with this family." The threat was clear: resolve this situation quickly and on his terms, or face escalating financial pressure that would force me back into complete dependence. My work schedule at Edward's office became another pressure point, with additional responsibilities and longer hours that made it difficult to attend meetings with Calder during normal business hours. "Commitment means being available when the business needs you," Edward said when I requested time off for legal appointments. "If these meetings are more important than your job responsibilities, maybe you need to reconsider your priorities." The trap was perfectly constructed. I couldn't attend necessary meetings without jeopardizing my only source of income, but I couldn't resolve the legal situation without attending those meetings. Edward's control over my schedule was just another way of maintaining control over information he desperately wanted but couldn't directly access. The relationship with Rhea Morgan became another casualty of Edward's campaign to isolate me and force disclosure about my inheritance. Rhea was my girlfriend of 8 months, someone I'd met at community college who came from a family that treated her with the kind of casual affection I'd never experienced. Edward's hostility toward her had always been barely concealed, but it intensified dramatically once my mysterious legal meetings began. "That girl is a distraction from more important matters," he told Camilla within my hearing. "Noah needs to focus on family responsibilities, not teenage romance." The pressure he applied was indirect but effective, making Rhea uncomfortable during her visits, questioning her family background and future plans, creating an atmosphere where her presence felt unwelcome and problematic. The breaking point with Rhea came when Edward took it upon himself to call her parents and express concerns about their daughter's relationship with someone who was dealing with complicated legal issues that might affect his stability. The conversation, as Rhea tearfully reported it to me, painted me as someone potentially involved in criminal activity or financial impropriety, someone her parents should be concerned about their daughter dating. "He made it sound like you were in some kind of serious trouble," she said, her confusion and hurt evident. "My dad wants to meet with you to discuss what's going on, and I don't know what to tell him because you won't tell me anything either." The wedge Edward had driven between us was perfectly calculated to make my silence appear suspicious while positioning himself as the concerned stepfather trying to protect everyone involved. The ultimatum came during a family meeting. Edward called on a Sunday evening, summoning everyone to the living room with the formal tone he used for major announcements about family policy or financial decisions. "This situation with Noah's legal meetings has gone on long enough," he began, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated over years of being the unquestioned head of household. "Whatever this is about, it's affecting the entire family, and we need full disclosure before it goes any further." The room felt charged with the kind of tension that preceded Edward's most decisive interventions, moments when he reshaped family dynamics to reassert his control over situations that had begun to slip away from him. "If this is about debts or legal problems from your biological father, we need to know now so we can protect this family's financial interests," he continued, his tone suggesting that my continued secrecy was both selfish and potentially dangerous. "If there are costs or liabilities involved, they cannot be allowed to impact Jasper and Lila's futures or our family's financial security." The assumption that my inheritance was a problem to be managed rather than an opportunity to be celebrated revealed everything about how Edward viewed my place in the family hierarchy. Even when discussing my biological father's legacy, the focus was on protecting his children from any potential negative consequences, rather than considering that something positive might finally be happening for me. Camilla's contribution to the ultimatum was perhaps the most devastating, because it came wrapped in maternal concern rather than Edward's obvious self-interest. "We love you, Noah," she said, reaching across the coffee table to squeeze my hand with practiced warmth. "But this secrecy is tearing the family apart. Edward can't sleep at night worrying about what legal troubles you might be facing alone. We want to help, but we can't do that if you won't trust us with the truth." The manipulation was so perfectly executed that for a moment I almost felt guilty for keeping secrets from people who claimed to love me, before remembering that these same people had hidden my father's attempts to contact me for 18 years while systematically destroying my self-worth. The deadline Edward set was typically authoritative and non-negotiable. I had until the following Friday to provide complete disclosure about my legal situation, including full copies of any documents I'd signed and contact information for the lawyers involved. "If you choose to continue this secrecy beyond that point," he said, with the cold finality that characterized his most serious threats, "you'll need to find somewhere else to live while you figure out your priorities. This family cannot continue to support someone who refuses to be honest about situations that might affect all of us." The eviction threat was his nuclear option, designed to force compliance through the fear of homelessness that had kept me obedient for so many years. As I sat in my room that night, staring at the trust documents hidden in my desk drawer, I realized that Friday's deadline wasn't just about Edward's need for control or information. It was about the fundamental question of whether I would continue to live as Noah Hargrove, the grateful stepchild who accepted whatever treatment his family chose to provide, or finally become Noah Sinclair Lewis, the heir to a fortune built by a father who'd never stopped loving me. The choice was terrifying in its finality, but for the first time in my life, I had the resources to make that choice on my own terms, rather than accepting whatever Edward decided was best for me. Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability, Edward having spent the week making increasingly pointed comments about family loyalty and the consequences of continued defiance. He'd arranged what he called a family conference for 7 o'clock that evening, inviting not just our immediate household but also his business partner Marcus and his wife, people whose presence was clearly intended to add gravity and witnesses to whatever confrontation he had planned. "Tonight, we resolve this situation once and for all," he announced over breakfast, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he'd maneuvered his opponent into an impossible position. "No more games, no more evasions. Tonight we get the truth." The living room had been arranged like a formal meeting, with Edward positioned behind his desk while additional chairs were brought in to accommodate our expanded audience. Marcus and his wife Sarah sat to Edward's right, their expressions appropriately serious for whatever family crisis they'd been told they were helping to resolve. Jasper and Lila flanked the couch where Camilla sat with nervous energy, her hands fidgeting with tissues in a way that suggested she knew this confrontation might not go according to Edward's carefully laid plans. "Before we begin," Edward said as I entered the room, "I want everyone to understand that what we discuss tonight affects the security and reputation of this entire family." I'd spent the morning with Calder Vance, finalizing the paperwork that would give me immediate access to trust funds and reviewing the legal protections that would shield me from exactly the kind of coercion Edward was about to attempt. "Remember," Calder had said as he handed me copies of every document, "you have no legal obligation to share this information with anyone. Your father anticipated this exact scenario and built protections specifically to prevent family members from pressuring you into disclosure or financial sharing." The manila envelope containing proof of my inheritance sat in my backpack, like evidence of a parallel universe where my worth wasn't subject to Edward's judgment or approval. Edward began his presentation with the calculated authority he brought to business negotiations, outlining what he called the facts as we know them about my mysterious legal situation. "For 6 weeks, Noah has been meeting secretly with lawyers and refusing to explain the nature of their business," he said, his tone suggesting that this behavior was both suspicious and deeply concerning to everyone present. "This secrecy has created anxiety for the entire family and raised questions about potential legal or financial liabilities that might affect all of us." The way he framed my privacy as a threat to family security was masterfully manipulative, positioning his demand for information as protective rather than invasive. Given Noah's history of poor judgment and his tendency to be influenced by people who don't have his best interests at heart, Edward continued, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of undermining my confidence, We're concerned that he may have gotten involved in something beyond his understanding or ability to handle alone. The casual destruction of my credibility in front of witnesses was so smoothly delivered that Marcus and Sarah nodded sympathetically, clearly seeing me as a troubled young man whose family was trying to help him avoid serious consequences for his naive mistakes. The ultimatum, when it came, was delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who believed he held all the power in the room. Tonight, Noah will provide complete disclosure about these legal meetings, including copies of any documents he's signed and contact information for the lawyers involved, Edward declared, pulling out a legal pad where he'd apparently prepared to take notes. If there are debts, liabilities, or legal problems stemming from his biological father's situation, we need full information so this family can protect itself appropriately. The assumption that my inheritance was a problem requiring damage control rather than a blessing to be celebrated perfectly captured Edward's view of my worth and potential. Alternatively, Edward said, his voice taking on the cold finality that characterized his most serious threats, Noah can choose to handle this situation entirely on his own, which means finding his own housing and support while he deals with whatever consequences arise from his secretive behavior. The eviction threat delivered in front of witnesses was designed to maximize pressure while demonstrating to his audience that he'd been more than reasonable in offering family support that I was ungratefully rejecting. The choice is entirely his, but it must be made tonight in front of everyone, so there's no confusion about what was decided. Marcus leaned forward with the expression of someone offering wise counsel to a misguided young person. Noah, your stepfather has been very patient with this situation, he said, with practiced sincerity. Whatever legal troubles you're facing, family support is invaluable. There's no shame in accepting help from people who care about you. The irony of receiving advice about accepting help from family members who'd spent years ensuring I understood I wasn't really family would have been funny if the stakes weren't so serious. Sarah nodded agreement, adding her own observations about the importance of trust and honesty in family relationships. Edward lit a cigar with theatrical ceremony, the expensive Cuban he saved for celebrating successful business negotiations or particularly satisfying personal victories. I'm confident we can resolve whatever problems have arisen, he said, exhaling smoke with obvious pleasure. Noah may have gotten in over his head, but this family has resources and connections that can solve most legal difficulties if we approach them correctly. The cigar was his victory symbol, lit prematurely but with absolute confidence that the evening would end with my complete surrender to his authority and my grateful acceptance of whatever help he chose to provide. The moment had arrived when I could either continue being Noah Hargrove, the grateful stepchild who accepted whatever treatment his family chose to provide, or finally become Noah Sinclair Lewis, heir to a fortune built by a father who'd never stopped loving me. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the manila envelope containing trust documents, inheritance papers, and proof of the $30 million that would change everything about the power dynamics in this room. You're right that this affects the family, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I'd expected. But not in the way you think. Edward's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as I placed the first document on his desk, the official notice of inheritance that listed Dr. Elias Ward's estate value and my status as sole beneficiary. What is this? He asked, his tone suggesting irritation rather than concern as he scanned the legal language that was about to destroy every assumption he'd built about my worth and his control over my future. The cigar remained clenched between his teeth, but his expression was already changing as the numbers on the page registered in his mind. My biological father died 8 weeks ago, I said, pulling out additional documents that detailed the trust structure, the monthly income streams, and the financial protections Dr. Ward had built specifically to prevent family members from pressuring me into sharing my inheritance. He left me $30 million, along with ongoing income from patents and investments that will provide more money than this family makes in a year, every month, for the rest of my life. The words hung in the air like a detonation, destroying every power dynamic that had defined our relationships for the past 14 years. Edward's cigar fell from his mouth onto his expensive desk, leaving a small burn mark on the wood as he stared at documents that proved everything he'd believed about my biological father, my worth, and his control over my future had been completely wrong. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Camilla's sharp intake of breath as she realized the magnitude of what she'd hidden and what it meant for her son's future. For the first time in my life, I possessed something Edward couldn't take away, control he couldn't manipulate, and resources that made his threats meaningless. The silence that followed Edward's dropped cigar stretched for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds before the reality of my inheritance began reshaping every relationship in that room. Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their role as witnesses to what they'd expected to be a family intervention, but had become something entirely different. Edward's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, calculation, and what looked like panic as he processed the implications of documents that proved his stepson was now worth more than his entire business and accumulated wealth combined. $30 million, he repeated slowly, as if saying the number aloud might make it less real or more manageable. Jasper was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and barely concealed resentment. "You're telling us that your deadbeat father, the one who supposedly abandoned you, was actually a millionaire who left you everything." The accusation in his tone suggested he thought I was somehow responsible for this deception, as if I'd known about the inheritance all along and deliberately hidden it to make them look foolish. Lila's reaction was more direct and calculating, her eyes already working through the implications for her own future and what my newfound wealth might mean for family dynamics she'd always assumed would favor her indefinitely. Camilla's response was the most devastating because it revealed the full scope of her betrayal in ways that even I hadn't fully understood. "I had to protect you," she said, her voice breaking as tears started flowing. "Elias was obsessed with you, Noah. He would have taken you away from the only stable family you'd ever known. I couldn't let him destroy our life together." The admission that she'd known about Dr. Ward's search efforts, his love for me, and his attempts to provide the relationship she'd stolen from both of us was delivered as if her deception had been an act of maternal protection rather than calculated cruelty designed to keep Edward happy and our household stable. Edward's recovery from shock was swift and predictable, his business instincts kicking in as he began calculating how to position himself advantageously in this dramatically altered family dynamic. "This changes things significantly," he said, his tone shifting from authoritative to collaborative in a way that would have been amusing if it weren't so transparently self-serving. "Obviously, we'll need to discuss how to manage this inheritance responsibly. $30 million is a substantial responsibility, and you'll need experienced guidance to avoid the mistakes that destroy most young people who inherit money they're not prepared to handle." The assumption that I would naturally turn to him for financial guidance, after years of him stealing my college fund and charging me rent, was so audacious it took conscious effort not to laugh. Marcus and Sarah began making uncomfortable excuses about needing to leave, clearly recognizing that they'd stumbled into a family situation far more complex and potentially explosive than they'd been prepared to witness. "Congratulations, Noah," Marcus said with the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to extract himself gracefully from an awkward situation. "This is certainly an unexpected development." Their hasty departure left the family alone to confront the new reality without the buffer of outside witnesses, and the atmosphere immediately became more charged with unspoken calculations and desperate repositioning. The transformation in how family members addressed me was immediate and nauseating in its transparent self-interest. Lila, who'd spent years making sure I understood my inferior status as the adopted child, suddenly became my concerned sister, worried about the emotional impact of learning about my father's death and the overwhelming responsibility of managing such wealth. "This must be so difficult for you," she said with practiced sympathy. "Finding out that your father loved you but died before you could meet him. We're here to support you through this transition." The word "we" suddenly included me in ways it never had before, now that I possessed resources that might benefit her future. Jasper's approach was more direct and business-oriented, suggesting that the inheritance created opportunities for family investments and shared ventures that could benefit everyone. "With this kind of money, you could really help elevate the entire family," he said with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already begun planning how to spend portions of my inheritance. "Dad's business could expand into new markets with proper capitalization. We could all benefit from strategic investments and partnerships." The casual assumption that my newfound wealth was naturally available for family use rather than my personal freedom perfectly captured the entitlement that had characterized their treatment of me for years. Edward's strategy was more sophisticated, positioning himself as the experienced advisor whose guidance would be essential for protecting my inheritance from bad decisions and predatory influences. "Money like this attracts all kinds of people who want to take advantage of inexperience," he warned with apparent concern for my welfare. "You'll need someone who understands finance and business to help you navigate investment decisions and avoid the scams that target young inheritors." The irony that he was offering to protect me from exactly the kind of financial manipulation he'd been practicing for years was apparently lost on him, though his desperation to maintain some form of control over my resources was obvious. Camilla's emotional manipulation was perhaps the most difficult to endure, because it combined genuine maternal love with calculated self-interest in ways that made it hard to separate her authentic feelings from her desperate attempts to maintain her position in my life. "I know you're angry about the secrets I kept," she said through tears that seemed real enough. "But everything I did was to protect the family we'd built together. I couldn't risk losing you to someone who might have taken you away from us." Her framing of Dr. Ward's love as a threat to our family bond rather than an opportunity for me to know my biological father revealed how completely she'd prioritized Edward's comfort over my right to know where I came from. The most satisfying moment came when I explained the legal protections Dr. Ward had built into the trust, specifically the clauses designed to prevent family members from pressuring me into financial sharing or inappropriate investments. My father anticipated this exact scenario, I told them, watching Edward's expression change as he realized that his usual tactics of manipulation and control wouldn't work on someone with independent resources and legal protection. The trust is structured so that any attempt to coerce or pressure me into sharing the inheritance triggers additional legal safeguards, including restraining orders and criminal charges for financial elder abuse. Edward's final attempt at maintaining control was a threat disguised as concern about family unity and my moral obligations to the people who'd raised me. "After everything this family has done for you," he said with the cold authority that had intimidated me for years, "I hope you'll remember that gratitude and loyalty are more important than money. This inheritance doesn't change the fact that you're part of this family, and you have responsibilities to the people who were there when you had nothing." The desperate quality of his appeal revealed how completely the power dynamic had shifted, and how little leverage he actually possessed over someone who no longer needed his approval or financial support. My response was measured and final, delivered with a calm I'd never felt before in Edward's presence. "You're right that this inheritance doesn't change some things," I said, looking directly at him while he processed the implications of my words. "It doesn't change the fact that you spent 14 years making sure I understood I wasn't really part of this family. It doesn't change the college fund you stole, or the rent you charged me for living in a house where your biological children never paid anything. Most importantly, it doesn't change the fact that while you were teaching me I was worthless, my real father was building a fortune specifically to give me the freedom to choose my own family." The evening ended not with reconciliation or shared celebration, but with the quiet recognition that relationships built on control and dependence cannot survive the elimination of those power imbalances. Edward's authority had been based entirely on my need for his approval and support. Without that need, he was just a man who'd spent years being cruel to someone who no longer had any reason to tolerate his behavior. Camilla's love had been conditional on my acceptance of her choices and secrets. Now that I knew the truth about what she'd hidden, we would have to rebuild our relationship on honesty rather than manipulation. 6 months later, I moved into a house of my own, using a small portion of my inheritance to purchase something that Dr. Ward would have been proud to see me living in. Rhea and I had reconciled after I explained the full situation and introduced her to the real story of my family dynamics and inheritance. The trust provided more than enough income for me to attend university full-time studying engineering, the field my biological father had mastered and the career path he'd always hoped I might choose. Edward's insurance business struggled financially after several of his major clients learned about his treatment of me and decided to work with competitors who better reflected their values about family and loyalty. The relationship with Camilla slowly improved as we worked through the betrayal and deception that had shaped my entire childhood, though it would never return to the unconditional trust that had existed before I learned how thoroughly she'd prioritized Edward's comfort over my right to know my father. Jasper and Lila's attempts to maintain close relationships faded quickly once they realized that my inheritance came with protections that prevented them from benefiting financially from their sudden interest in family bonds. The house felt emptier without the constant tension of Edward's need to control and diminish me, but it also felt more honest in ways that made genuine connection possible for the first time. The most meaningful discovery came through videos and letters Dr. Ward had left, not just about money and inheritance, but about dreams and hopes he'd maintained for a son he'd never stopped loving. His belief in my potential, his pride in what I might accomplish, and his determination to provide me with choices rather than limitations gave me something more valuable than financial security. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be unconditionally loved by a parent who saw my future as limitless rather than constrained by my willingness to accept whatever treatment others chose to provide.